Millionaire CEO was mistaken for a homeless man by a poor girl, but her kindness led to a life-changing connection. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main characters. The winter sun was sliding behind the rooftops when Grace Miller stepped out of the corner bakery after her long shift, her thin jacket barely holding back the cold. She tightened it around herself as a gust of wind swept down the street, carrying the scent of exhaust and the faint chatter of people heading home. That was when she saw him, sitting near the end of the block beside a closed hardware store, hunched against the brick wall, a torn backpack at his feet. His hair was mussed, his jaw shadowed like he'd been traveling for days, and the once expensive shirt he wore was wrinkled and smudged with city dust. To anyone passing by, he looked like another man who had slipped through the cracks of the world. But Grace slowed, her breath clouding in the cold, noticing details others ignored. The way he tried to sit upright despite shivering. The way he avoided looking at anyone, as if he didn't want to burden them with his existence. She'd grown up recognizing that kind of quiet dignity. She understood it. And even though she barely had enough for herself, her hands moved before her doubts could stop them. She walked toward him with gentle steps. "Hey, are you all right?" she asked softly. The man, Ethan Cole, though she didn't know that and though he didn't offer it, lifted his eyes. There was gratitude there, and something like disbelief, as if kindness was the last thing he expected tonight. Grace held out the extra cup of hot coffee she'd bought using her last $5. "You look cold. Please take this." Ethan hesitated, almost startled, his fingers brushing hers as he accepted the cup. It warmed more than his hands. It warmed a part of him he didn't know had grown numb. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice rough from hours of silence. Grace offered a small smile, the kind that made strangers feel seen. "Take care, okay?" She didn't linger. She didn't expect anything. She simply turned, adjusting her backpack and continuing down the sidewalk toward the bus stop, unaware that her simple act had just shifted the course of two lives. Behind her, Ethan watched her go, the steam from the coffee curling up into the fading light. For the first time that day, he felt something steady inside him, like hope returning after a long absence. And Grace had no idea that the man she believed was struggling to survive the night was actually one of the most powerful CEOs in the city, and that her kindness had just reached the one place his wealth had never been able to touch, his heart. Grace hurried toward the bus stop, her shoes tapping softly against the sidewalk as the last traces of daylight slipped behind the city skyline. The cold worked its way through her thin jacket, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment she handed the stranger her only warm drink. It had been nothing more than instinct, a quiet pull in her chest that refused to ignore someone shivering alone on a winter evening. Still, the consequences landed quickly. When she reached the diner where she worked the morning shift, her manager was waiting with crossed arms and a stern look. Grace apologized for being late earlier, explained that the bus had been delayed, but he only shook his head. "Grace, this is the third time this month. I need reliability." She promised she would do better, her voice small but steady. Inside, she felt the sting of knowing she was telling the truth but not being believed. By the time she stepped back out into the cold, she was carrying fewer hours for next week. She pressed her lips together, refusing to let frustration take over. Helping someone had been the right thing to do. Even if it cost her something, she could live with that. Across town, Ethan sat in the back of a rideshare, still holding the empty cup she had given him. The heat had long faded, but the memory of her kindness had not. He rubbed his thumb along the cardboard sleeve, feeling the faint indentation of the brand logo. It seemed absurd that such a simple object could settle so heavily in his mind. Earlier that day, he had walked out of a board meeting overwhelmed, stripped of the polish that usually framed his life. Nothing had gone according to plan. Losing his wallet and having his phone die only added to the chaos. For hours, he had wandered the streets trying to look like he had everything under control, but Grace had seen through every layer without even knowing who he was. When he arrived at his penthouse, the doorman greeted him as usual, but Ethan barely heard it. He stood in the elevator, watching the doors close, his reflection staring back at him. Cleaner now, sharper, unmistakably the man who held more power than he ever showed. Yet, for the first time, he felt out of place in his own life. Grace's voice echoed faintly in his mind. You look cold. Please take this. No one had spoken to him that gently in a long time, not without wanting something in return. When the elevator reached the top floor, he exhaled slowly, realizing something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Her kindness had touched him more deeply than he was prepared to admit. And somewhere in the quiet of his expansive home, he understood that this was not the last time he wanted to see her. Meanwhile, Grace boarded her bus, leaning her head against the window as the city lights blurred into soft halos. She wondered if the man was all right, if the coffee had warmed him even a little. Tomorrow would bring new problems, new hours to fill, new bills to worry about. But tonight she held on to one truth. Compassion mattered, even when no one noticed. Neither of them knew it yet, but their worlds had already begun shifting toward each other, drawn together by a moment neither could forget. By the next morning, the city felt different to Ethan, as if a thin layer of noise had lifted and left him alone with his thoughts. His schedule was packed, his assistant had already sent 3 reminders, and a stack of reports waited on his desk, but none of it struck him with the urgency it usually did. Instead, as his driver pulled up to the headquarters of Coal Industries, Ethan found himself glancing at the cup sleeve he had kept from the night before. He tucked it into the inside pocket of his coat, unsure why he could not bring himself to throw it away. Inside the towering glass building, employees straightened at the sight of him, offering polite greetings. He responded with a nod, moving through the lobby with practiced ease, but his mind drifted back to Grace and the gentle concern in her voice. It lingered like a thread he could not pull loose. In the boardroom, discussions unfolded about numbers, expansion plans, and quarterly projections. Ethan listened, contributed, and made decisions, but there was a distance in his gaze, as if part of him remained on that quiet sidewalk where a stranger had looked at him without judgment. During a short break, he stepped out onto the balcony that overlooked the city. The wind was cold, brushing against his face, and he realized how rare it was for him to feel the world this way, without layers of separation. Grace had seen him not as a title or a paycheck, but as a human being in need. That simple acknowledgement had pierced through a loneliness he had ignored for years. Meanwhile, Grace sat at her small kitchen table, counting the tips she had managed to gather over the week. The diner cutting her hours meant she would have to find extra shifts elsewhere, and the rent deadline was only days away. Still, when she remembered the look in the stranger's eyes as he accepted the coffee, she felt no regret. Her life had taught her that kindness could not be measured in dollars, even when she desperately needed more of them. She folded her work apron, smoothing its worn edges, and whispered a tiny prayer that tomorrow would be kinder to her than today. Back at the office, Ethan surprised his assistant by canceling the rest of his afternoon meetings. He claimed he needed to reset his priorities, something he had never said before. As he left the building, he felt an unfamiliar pull, guiding him back toward the part of the city where Grace worked. He did not know what he would say if he saw her again. He only knew that the world had felt a little warmer when she smiled at him, and he wanted to understand why. Grace, on the other hand, was wiping down tables in the small cafe where she worked evening shifts, unaware that her day was about to take a turn she never expected. Ethan paused outside the window, watching her with quiet fascination. She moved with a mixture of tiredness and determination, humming softly as she worked. She looked real in a way that few people in his wealthy circle ever did. For a moment, he simply stood there, feeling something gentle and grounding settle inside him. Then he took a breath, pushed open the door, and stepped into her world once more. The small bell above the cafe door chimed as Ethan stepped inside, carrying with him a soft swirl of cold air. Grace looked up from the counter, her eyes widening in recognition. For a heartbeat, she simply stared, unsure if she was imagining him. The last time she saw him, he looked lost and exhausted on a cold sidewalk. Now, though still dressed simply, he stood straighter, cleaner, almost out of place in the cozy warmth of the cafe. "Hey," Grace said cautiously, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You are here." Ethan offered a gentle smile, one that held both gratitude and a hint of nervousness. I wanted to thank you. Properly, I mean. For last night. Grace felt her cheeks warm. No one ever hunted her down to say thank you. It was nothing, she replied quickly. You looked cold. Anyone would have done the same. Ethan almost told her the truth right there. That not everyone would have stopped. That in fact dozens of people had walked past him without a second glance. But he swallowed the words, choosing instead to sit at a corner table. Could I get whatever you recommend? He asked. Grace blinked. Most customers had opinions. He had none. Sure, she said, reaching for the menu. Our cinnamon latte is good. And inexpensive. Ethan nodded. I will take that. As she prepared his drink, she found herself glancing at him. There was something different about him today, a quiet steadiness beneath the tired eyes she remembered. When she brought the cup to his table, he accepted it carefully, like it meant more than he could say. You work 2 jobs? He asked softly, noticing the exhaustion she tried to hide. Grace shrugged. Rent does not pay itself. I pick up shifts wherever I can. Her tone was light, but Ethan heard the truth beneath it. He wanted to help, but he had to tread carefully. If he revealed who he was now, it would change everything too fast. Do you ever get time for yourself? He asked. Grace laughed gently. Time is expensive. I cannot afford much of it. Ethan held her gaze for a moment, feeling the honesty in her smile. She moved to wipe down the next table, leaving behind the soft scent of cinnamon and soap. A few customers trickled in, and Grace shifted easily into her routine, greeting them with warmth despite her tired posture. Ethan watched, struck by how naturally she cared for strangers, how her kindness did not depend on who they were or what they had. When she returned to his table, he cleared his throat. Grace, right? She nodded, surprised he remembered. I was wondering, he continued, if you might allow me to buy you dinner sometime. As thanks. Nothing more. Grace froze, her fingers tightening around the edge of her apron. No one like him, gentle, steady, composed even in simplicity, had ever asked her anything like that. Dinner, she echoed. Ethan nodded, trying to hide the hope behind his calm expression. Only if you want to. She studied him for a long moment. He had not acted entitled. He had not made her uncomfortable. He had simply shown up, quietly and sincerely. Maybe, she whispered. I would need to check my work schedule. A small spark lit in Ethan's eyes. Then I hope your schedule is kind to me. Grace felt a laugh escape her, light and unexpected. For the first time that day, her burdens felt just a little less heavy. And as Ethan finished his drink, he knew something with absolute clarity. He would find a way to see her again, no matter how long it took. Ethan returned to the cafe the next evening, unsure if Grace would even be there. He felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest as he walked past the windows, scanning the warm interior until he finally spotted her tying her apron behind the counter. Something inside him settled at the sight. She glanced up, surprised but not displeased. You came back, she said with a small smile. I was not sure you would. Ethan stepped closer, his voice gentle. I hoped you might have an answer about dinner. Grace pressed her lips together, her fingers tapping lightly against the counter while she considered it. I get off in about an hour, she said quietly. If you still want to wait. Ethan nodded without hesitation. I will wait. Grace tried to hide the way that simple promise warmed her, but the tiny lift of her expression gave her away. While she finished her shift, Ethan chose a corner seat where he could watch without intruding. He noticed the small details, how she listened with full attention when customers spoke, how she checked the temperature of the drinks with a thoughtful touch, how she smiled even when her shoulders dropped with exhaustion. She was not performing. She was simply kind. When her hour finally ended, Grace slipped out from behind the counter. There is a little diner down the block, she suggested. It is nothing fancy, but the food is warm. Her gaze flicked over his simple clothing, still unaware that the man beside her could afford the most exclusive restaurants in the city. Ethan nodded. Warm sounds perfect. As they walked, their steps fell into an easy rhythm. Streetlights glowed softly overhead, casting long shadows along the sidewalk. Grace tucked her hands into her jacket sleeves, trying to guard against the chill. Ethan noticed and gently offered his scarf. This might help, he said. Grace hesitated, but the cold won. Thank you, she whispered, wrapping it around herself. The moment felt strangely intimate, yet safe. Inside the diner, a small booth near the window became their space for the night. The hum of conversation around them faded as they talked. Grace shared pieces of her life in simple, honest fragments. How she grew up in a small town, how she moved to the city hoping for better opportunities, how the cost of living had slowly chipped at her dreams. Ethan listened with a depth of attention that surprised even him. His world was usually filled with people who talked more than they listened, people who sought favors or approval. Grace wanted neither. "What about you?" she finally asked. "What do you do?" Ethan paused, choosing his words carefully. "I work in business," he said, truthful yet incomplete. "It is demanding, and sometimes I lose track of what matters." Grace nodded with quiet understanding. "Life does that. It pushes until you forget the good parts." Her voice softened. "But I hope you find them again." Ethan felt something shift inside him, a gentle realization that she was speaking directly to a place he rarely let anyone see. As their plates emptied and the night grew later, Grace checked the time and sighed. "I should go. I have an early shift tomorrow." Ethan stood with her, reluctant for the evening to end. "May I walk you home?" Grace hesitated at first, weighing her trust, but eventually nodded. "All right." They stepped back into the cold. Their walk was quiet, but not uncomfortable, filled with unspoken things neither knew how to name yet. When they reached her building, Grace turned to him, holding the scarf in her hands. "Thank you for tonight," she said. "And for this." Ethan shook his head softly. "Keep it for now. It looks better on you anyway." Grace smiled, touched by the simple sincerity. "Good night, Ethan." As she disappeared into the dimly lit stairwell, Ethan remained on the sidewalk for a long moment, watching the door close behind her. Something about this woman was beginning to anchor him in ways his wealth never had. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that he would return to her world again. Grace woke the next morning with a lingering softness in her chest, the kind that comes from a night that felt almost unreal. Ethan's scarf was draped neatly over the back of her single kitchen chair, carrying the faint scent of winter air and something warm she could not name. She touched the fabric for a moment, letting the memory of his gentle smile settle over her. Then reality tugged her back. Work, rent, bills. Life did not pause just because someone unexpectedly kind had stepped into it. Across the city, Ethan was equally distracted, though he tried to hide it behind his usual calm exterior. In the sleek conference room of Coal Industries, executives discussed projections while Ethan stared at the digital charts, seeing numbers, but thinking only of the way Grace's eyes softened when she laughed. His assistant, Margaret, leaned toward him quietly. "Sir, are you all right? You seem elsewhere today." Ethan blinked, straightening. "Just rethinking priorities," he said. It was the closest thing to the truth he could offer. After the meeting, he slipped out early, something he never did. His driver waited as usual, but Ethan waved him off and walked toward the street instead. He needed space to think. He had spent years managing billion-dollar decisions, yet he could not seem to understand why one woman's smile held more weight than entire corporate strategies. By afternoon, he was standing outside the cafe again, unsure why he had come. Grace was inside restocking the pastry case, her hair tied up loosely, her expression focused. When she spotted him, she looked surprised, but not disappointed. She stepped out during her short break, pulling her jacket tighter as a cool breeze brushed across the street. "I did not expect to see you today," she said, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Ethan smiled, hands in his pockets. "I was in the area." Grace's eyebrows lifted slightly. She knew that was unlikely. Their worlds were not the kind that naturally overlapped. But she chose not to press him. Instead, she leaned against the brick wall, looking up at him with quiet curiosity. "Did your day get any better?" Ethan let out a slow breath. "In some ways, yes. In others, I am realizing I may have been living very far from real life." Grace laughed softly. "Most people do, without realizing it. But you seem like someone who wants to understand more than just your own world." He studied her face for a moment, struck again by how she never asked for anything, never tried to pull information from him the way others always did. She simply listened and cared. "Would you allow me to walk you home again tonight?" he asked gently. "If you are comfortable with that." Grace hesitated, not out of fear, but because she was unused to anyone choosing her so intentionally. "All right," she finally said. "But I should warn you, it is not a glamorous walk." "Those are my favorite kind," Ethan replied softly. Grace looked at him with a mix of amusement and confusion. Something about him did not add up. His posture was too upright, his voice too calm, his presence too steady to belong to the life she assumed he lived. She almost asked about it, but the cafe door swung open and her manager called her back inside. Before she returned to work, she glanced at Ethan one more time. "Tonight then," she said. And as she disappeared into the cafe, Ethan felt something full and undeniable bloom inside him. With each passing moment, he found himself sinking deeper into Grace's world, a world built not on wealth or prestige, but on sincerity. A world he was in no hurry to leave. Evening settled slowly across the city, softening the sharp edges of buildings and casting a warm amber glow onto the sidewalks. Grace stepped out of the cafe at the end of her shift, rubbing her hands together for warmth as she scanned the street. Ethan was already there, standing beneath a street lamp with his hands tucked into his coat pockets. He looked up the moment she appeared, and something subtle but unmistakable eased in his expression. "You waited," Grace said, almost surprised. Ethan nodded. "I said I would." They began walking toward her neighborhood, falling into a quiet rhythm that felt more comfortable each time they shared it. Cars passed slowly along the street, and the glow from small storefronts lit their path. Grace noticed how Ethan walked slightly closer to the curb, as if instinctively shielding her from the cold wind. "So," she said softly, "what made you rethink your priorities today?" Ethan hesitated. He could feel her curiosity brushing just beneath the surface, gentle but real. "Being on the street the other night," he said carefully, "it made me realize how disconnected I have been from everything. People walked past me like I was invisible." Grace slowed her steps, her voice softening. "People forget to look. It does not mean you do not matter." Ethan smiled faintly. "You looked." Grace shook her head. "I just saw someone who needed help." What she did not know was how rare that simple act was in his world. As they continued, Grace began noticing small things about him that did not fit the image she had assumed. His posture was too refined, his vocabulary too precise. Even the way he held conversations suggested a man used to boardrooms rather than break rooms. At one point, she glanced at him sideways. "Ethan, what kind of business are you in exactly?" Ethan felt his breath catch for a second. He had rehearsed versions of the truth, but none of them seemed safe yet. Not when he feared the truth might create distance she would never cross again. "Consulting," he answered gently. "Sometimes it feels like herding storms, sometimes like chasing shadows. I doubt it is as interesting as you imagine." Grace studied him quietly, recognizing the evasiveness but choosing not to push. Everyone had parts of themselves they were not ready to share. "Well," she said, lightly, "you seem good at listening. That is an important skill in any job." Ethan chuckled softly. "It is easier around you." They reached her block, where the buildings grew older and the lights dimmed. Grace's steps slowed, ashamed of the peeling paint and cracked sidewalk. She tucked her hands into her jacket. "Sorry," she murmured. "My neighborhood is not exactly impressive." Ethan stopped walking and gently turned to face her. "Grace," he said, his voice low and sincere, "I am not here for impressive." She felt heat rise to her cheeks, the kind that came when someone saw past the surface of her life. A moment of quiet settled between them, soft and full. Then a car pulled up at the end of the street, sleek and unfamiliar in this part of town. A man in a suit stepped out and called, "Mr. Cole, your 9 o'clock is ready when you are." Grace blinked, confusion flickering across her face. She turned slowly toward Ethan. "Mr. Cole." Ethan exhaled, the moment he feared arriving sooner than he hoped. Grace stared at him, her voice no more than a whisper. "Ethan, who are you really?" His answer hovered on his lips, fragile and heavy with everything he had tried to protect. And as the streetlight flickered above them, the delicate balance of their fragile connection shifted, edging toward a truth neither of them could ignore any longer. Grace stood frozen on the sidewalk, the cool night air brushing against her cheeks as the man in the suit waited beside the sleek car. Ethan felt the weight of her stare, a mixture of confusion and something far more fragile. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as if the truth might soften if spoken gently. "Grace," he murmured, "I was going to tell you. I just needed more time." Her breath caught as she studied him, piecing together everything she had overlooked. The calm confidence, the careful speech, the subtle elegance in the way he carried himself. None of it belonged to a man struggling on the street. "Mr. Cole," she whispered, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. Why would someone like you be sitting outside a hardware store looking like you had nowhere to go? Ethan swallowed, searching for a version of the truth that did not sound like a lie. I had a long day, he said slowly. My wallet was stolen, my phone died, and I walked for hours without anyone noticing me. Except you. Grace looked down, the memory of offering him a warm drink twisting into something uncomfortable. So you let me believe you were homeless? She asked softly. Ethan flinched at the hurt in her voice. I never said I was. You assumed, and I did not correct you. I should have. He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. I wanted one moment where someone saw me without knowing my title, my company, or my reputation. Grace lifted her eyes, searching his face for sincerity. She found plenty of it, but it only made her chest ache more. The suited driver approached cautiously. Sir, the meeting will not wait much longer. Ethan held up a hand, never breaking eye contact with her. Grace, please understand. The night we met, you did not look at me with expectations. You did not want anything from me. You helped me because you were kind. Grace shook her head gently, backing away a single step. And you let me think we lived in the same world. Ethan felt something inside him tighten. I was afraid that if I told you, this, whatever this is between us, would vanish before it even had a chance. She wrapped his scarf more tightly around herself, as if trying to hide from the truth settling in. I do not belong in your world, Ethan. You belong anywhere kindness matters, he said firmly. And that matters to me more than you know. But the revelation had cracked something delicate. Grace's gaze drifted from him to the car, to the driver waiting respectfully, then back to the man who had seemed so different just hours ago. I need time, she whispered. I cannot make sense of this right now. Ethan stepped forward, his expression soft but urgent. Grace, she held up her hand gently, stopping him without touch. Go to your meeting. It is clearly important. The words were calm, but he heard what she did not say. Our worlds are too far apart. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of time slipping through his fingers. At last he nodded, though every part of him resisted. I will call you tomorrow, he said. If you let me. Grace did not promise anything. She simply turned and walked toward her building, each step quiet, steady, and heartbreakingly distant. Ethan watched her disappear up the stairwell, the door closing softly behind her. For the first time in a very long time, the man who owned half the skyline felt completely powerless. And as he stepped into the waiting car, he realized the truth he had tried to avoid. Hiding who he was had not protected their connection. It had threatened to break it. The night after their fragile goodbye stretched long for both of them, each minute pulling at the thread of uncertainty between their worlds. Grace lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling as the city hummed below her window. Ethan's scarf rested on the chair beside her bed, the soft fabric a reminder of something warm and sincere, now tangled with a truth she did not know how to hold. She replayed their conversations, his quiet smiles, the way he listened with genuine interest, and then the moment she heard someone call him Mr. Cole. The shift had been instant, like the ground beneath her feet had tilted. She had not been speaking to a man rebuilding his life. She had been speaking to a man whose name likely appeared in business magazines. A man who owned a driver, a schedule, a world she had only seen through bus windows. Meanwhile, across the city in a penthouse high above the streets, Ethan sat in his dim living room, the city lights flickering across the glass walls. His phone sat untouched on the coffee table. He wanted to call her, but every instinct urged him to give her space. For years he had controlled outcomes, steered empires, and navigated crises. Yet tonight, he felt like a man standing in the doorway of a life he longed for but feared he had already damaged. Margaret, his assistant, found him unusually quiet the next morning. Sir, you have 6 messages from the board and 3 requests for interviews, she reminded him gently. Ethan pressed a hand to his forehead. Delay anything that is not critical. Margaret hesitated. Is everything all right? Ethan exhaled. No, but I am trying to make it right. He spent the rest of the day distracted, rereading the last message Grace had sent him days ago about her shift schedule. Simple words. No hint of the storm to come. She did not text him that day. Or the next. At the cafe, Grace moved through her shifts with a softness dulled by worry. Her manager noticed her quietness, but did not comment. Customers laughed and chatted around her, unaware of the tug-of-war happening behind her tired eyes. A coworker teased lightly. "You look like someone stole your sunshine." Grace forced a smile, but her heart was heavy. She wondered if she had overreacted. Ethan had never been unkind. He had never lied outright. But the gap between them felt impossibly wide now, and she had spent most of her life learning how to survive falls from heights she should never have climbed. Late in the afternoon, she stepped outside for a breath of cool air. The street felt louder than usual, the busier pace making her feel even smaller than normal. She wrapped Ethan's scarf around herself, unsure whether she meant to return it or cling to it. At the same moment, Ethan stood in his office, staring out over the skyline, as if he could somehow locate her through sheer will. He knew he had to try again, to explain properly, to bridge the distance with honesty instead of fear. "Grace," he whispered to the glass, as if her name alone carried the hope he was struggling to hold. Somewhere beneath the weight of their separate worries, they were both beginning to understand a truth neither could ignore. Caring for someone did not erase the differences between their worlds. But it might, if given the chance, build a path across them. And that possibility was something neither of them had felt in years. The third day of silence pressed heavily on Ethan, settling over him like a weight he could not shake. Meetings slipped by without holding his attention, and even the constant stream of decisions waiting on his desk felt strangely distant. By late afternoon, he pushed back from the conference table and told Margaret to clear the rest of his schedule. She studied him with quiet concern, but obeyed without question. Ethan left the building, stepping into the cool air with a clarity he had not felt in days. He could not keep hoping Grace would reach out. He needed to go to her, to explain everything honestly, without hesitation or hiding. Meanwhile, Grace finished her evening shift at the cafe, wiping the counters with slow, distracted motions. Her coworker nudged her lightly. "Are you sure you are all right? You have been somewhere else all week." Grace forced a small laugh. "Just tired." But she knew the truth was deeper. She had not stopped thinking about Ethan, about the way he stood under the street lamp with sincerity in his eyes, about the fact that he belonged to a world she had never touched. When her shift ended, she stepped outside, pulling Ethan's scarf closer around her neck. The night was calm, the sky a deep navy brushed with faint stars. She started down the sidewalk toward her apartment, her mind tangled with questions she had not let herself ask. And then she saw him. Ethan stood at the corner near the cafe, hands in his coat pockets, looking both hopeful and uncertain. He straightened slightly when her eyes met his. For a moment neither of them moved. Then he took a slow step forward. "Grace," he said softly, as if her name alone carried everything he wanted to tell her. Grace's heart thudded, but she held her ground. "Ethan, why are you here?" He exhaled, the breath leaving him with visible relief just to finally be near her again. "Because I cannot let things stay the way they are. I should have told you the truth sooner. I should have trusted that you deserved the full story." Grace shifted, her fingers tightening around the ends of the scarf she still wore. "You let me believe something that was not true," she said quietly. "You let me think we were the same." Ethan took another step closer, careful not to overwhelm her. "Grace, the night we met, I was lost in more ways than one. Not just without a wallet or phone. I was lost in my own life. You saw me as a person, not as a headline or a company. I did not want that moment to disappear." Grace looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you are still a millionaire CEO, and I am still me." Ethan's expression softened with something deep and unwavering. "And what you are is the most genuine person I have met in years. You helped me without hesitation. You talked to me like I mattered when I felt invisible. Grace, that means more to me than the world I come from." She shook her head slightly, torn between what her heart felt and what her fears warned her about. I do not know if I fit anywhere near your life." Ethan's voice lowered. "Then let me prove to you that you do not have to change who you are to matter to me." Grace lifted her eyes slowly, meeting his. For the first time since the truth was revealed, she saw not the CEO the world admired, but the man who had stood cold and alone on a sidewalk, grateful for a single act of kindness. The silence between them shifted, softening. Ethan took one final step, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cool night air. "Grace," he whispered, "let me try to make things right." And standing there beneath the streetlights, she realized she was not ready to walk away. Not yet. Not when something she had never expected was still unfolding between them, fragile but undeniably real. For a long moment, Grace stood in the quiet street, the cool air brushing against her cheeks, as Ethan waited with a patience that carried both hope and uncertainty. She could feel the sincerity in his words, the way his voice trembled just enough to reveal how much he meant them. "Ethan," she murmured, "I am not saying no. I just need to understand what all of this means." Ethan nodded gently. "Then let me show you. Not with promises, but with actions." Over the next week, he did exactly that. He did not overwhelm her with gifts or lavish gestures. Instead, he appeared in ways that fit her world, not his. He walked her home after late shifts, carrying an extra cup of hot tea because he remembered how cold her hands got at night. He sat in the cafe during her breaks, listening as she talked about her dreams of studying baking, her fear of falling behind in life, her quiet hope that one day she might have more than just enough. He never once made her feel small for wanting simple things. And to Grace's surprise, he shared pieces of himself too. Not the magazine version of Ethan Cole, but the human one. How success sometimes felt like a cage, how people rarely spoke to him without measuring what they could gain, how that night on the street had been the closest he had felt to invisible in years. Grace listened, realizing slowly that loneliness looked the same in penthouses as it did in cramped apartments. Still, uncertainty lingered. One evening, as they walked along the riverfront, Grace finally voiced the question that had sat in her heart. "Why me?" Ethan looked out at the shimmering water, his breath forming faint clouds in the cool air. "Because you saw me," he said simply. "Not the money, not the company, not the expectations. Just me. And I want to spend time with the person who made me feel human again." Grace felt her chest tighten, the sincerity in his voice pressing gently against the wall she had built to protect herself. She stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "Ethan, I do not want to be someone who gets swallowed by your world. I have worked too hard to stay grounded." He stepped closer, enough for her to feel the warmth radiating from him in the cold evening. "Then do not enter my world," he said softly. "Let me learn to be part of yours." His words were so gentle, so disarming, that Grace had to look away for a moment. She had spent most of her life believing that bridges between worlds like theirs did not hold. But Ethan was not asking her to cross a bridge. He was asking to meet her where she stood. Slowly, cautiously, she nodded. "If we continue this," she whispered, "it has to be honest. Always honest." Ethan reached out, not to take her hand, but to offer it, an open gesture, a quiet promise. "Honest," he agreed. Every step, Grace placed her hand in his, feeling the steadiness of his touch, and something inside her finally softened. As they continued their walk beneath the glow of the riverfront lights, neither spoke for a while. They did not need to. For the first time since the truth had shattered their fragile beginning, the path ahead no longer felt divided. It felt shared, uncertain, imperfect, but real in a way that neither of them had expected. And sincerity, not wealth, was the thing that finally allowed Grace's heart to open. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet steadiness, as if Grace and Ethan were learning how to breathe in the same rhythm. Their connection grew not through grand gestures, but through small, sincere moments that fit into the corners of their everyday lives. Ethan would walk her to the bus stop after late shifts, both of them wrapped in the cool night air, talking about simple things that somehow felt important. Grace would bring him pastries she had practiced baking, laughing shyly as he tasted each one with genuine delight. And yet, beneath the warmth of their growing bond, Ethan felt there was still something he needed to give her, something that honored the very beginning of their story. One crisp Saturday morning, he invited her to meet him in the old neighborhood where they had first crossed paths. Grace arrived wearing his scarf, her cheeks rosy from the cold. She looked around with curiosity. "Why here?" Ethan smiled softly. "Because this is where everything started." He guided her toward a small community center that had recently been renovated. The brick walls were freshly restored, the windows warm with light, and a modest sign hung above the door. Grace read it slowly. "Warm Hands Initiative." She blinked. "Ethan, what is this?" He hesitated, then spoke with quiet sincerity. "It is a project I have been working on. A program that provides hot meals, warm clothing, and basic support to people who feel unseen. Your kindness reminded me of what real compassion looks like." I wanted to build something that reflects that. Grace stared at him, surprised, touched, and overwhelmed all at once. She stepped inside with him, and her breath caught when she saw the small lobby. On the wall, mounted in a simple wooden frame, was the scarf she had given him the night she thought he was homeless. Beneath it was a small plaque that read, "A single act of kindness can change more than one life." Grace pressed a hand to her mouth, her emotions swelling. "Ethan, you did not have to do this." "I know," he said gently, "but I wanted to honor the moment that changed everything for me." She moved closer to the frame, her eyes tracing the familiar pattern in the fabric. It looked almost sacred now, preserved not as a symbol of pity, but of connection, of a beginning neither of them could have predicted. Ethan reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Grace turned to him slowly, her heartbeat quickening. He opened the box to reveal a simple silver ring, elegant but not flashy, and beside it, carefully preserved, was the cardboard sleeve from the cup of coffee she had given him that first night. The sleeve had been cleaned and smoothed, its edges neat, its shape intact. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. He held the box out to her, his eyes steady and sincere. "I kept this because it reminded me of the moment someone looked at me with pure compassion. I wanted to ask you, Grace Miller, if you would continue this journey with me, not because of who I am, but because of who we are together." Tears shimmered in her eyes, warm and unexpected. She touched the coffee sleeve gently, then looked into his eyes. "Ethan, yes. 1,000 times yes." The world around them seemed to soften into a glow, the warmth of the community center wrapping around them as Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger. In that moment, there was no divide between their worlds. No distance, no doubt, just two lives that had collided through kindness, now woven together by choice. 1 year later, the community center that had once been only a quiet dream stood full of life. The Warm Hands Initiative had expanded into a vibrant hub, offering warm meals, classes, and a safe place for anyone who needed to feel seen. Children laughed in the activity room, volunteers sorted donated coats, and the soft hum of conversation filled the hallways like a gentle melody. Grace walked through the main corridor with a clipboard in hand, greeting volunteers by name. She had become the heart of the center, her warmth shaping every corner of the place. People gravitated toward her not because of Ethan, not because she wore a ring, but because she carried kindness the way others carried breath. Near the entrance, the framed scarf and coffee sleeve still hung proudly on the wall. Visitors would often stop to read the plaque, and Grace would smile each time she passed it, reminded of the cold night that had transformed into something beautiful. That afternoon, the center was celebrating its first anniversary. Volunteers set out trays of cupcakes Grace had baked herself, each one simple, sweet, and made with the same care she offered the world. Ethan stood near the welcome table, talking with a group of donors, but his eyes kept drifting toward Grace with an affection that never faded. When the small ceremony began, Ethan joined her in front of the crowd. "Thank you all for being here," he said warmly. "This place was built on one belief. Every act of kindness creates a ripple, and those ripples can change lives." Grace felt her throat tighten at his words. She stepped forward, addressing the room with her gentle voice. "I used to think that big changes needed big actions. But it turns out, it started with a single cup of warm coffee. Sometimes hope is that small." Laughter and applause filled the room, not loud or overwhelming, but heartfelt. After the speeches, Ethan took Grace's hand and guided her toward a quieter corner beneath the framed scarf. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked, his thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles. Grace smiled softly. "Every day, it reminds me that kindness is never wasted." Ethan took a slow breath, his eyes warm as they held hers. "There is something I want to show you." He led her to a small door near the back of the lobby. When he opened it, Grace gasped. Inside was a tiny bakery kitchen, equipped with new appliances, shelves of ingredients, and a sign above the counter that read, "Grace's Oven, a place where kindness rises." Her hands flew to her mouth. "Ethan, what is this?" "It is your bakery," he said softly. "The one you dreamed of. A place inside the center, where your gifts can reach everyone who walks through these doors." Tears welled in Grace's eyes as she stepped inside, touching the smooth countertops, the neatly arranged baking tools, the handwritten message Ethan had left on a note beside the oven. For the woman who taught me what it means to be human. When she turned to him, her voice trembled. I do not know how to thank you. Ethan shook his head gently. You already have. Every single day. Grace walked back to him, her heart full, her voice soft. Ethan, this life we built, it feels like everything finally fits. He drew her into his arms, holding her with the same warmth she had once offered him through a simple act on a cold street. Grace, he whispered, your kindness changed my world. And now, together, we can change others too. As the sounds of celebration drifted through the hall, and the scent of freshly baked pastries filled the air, Grace rested her head against his chest. Their story had begun with broken pieces, loneliness, misunderstanding, 2 lives out of sync. But kindness had stitched those pieces together, creating something whole and enduring. And in the soft glow of the center they had built, surrounded by the ripple effects of a single warm gesture, Grace and Ethan began the next chapter of a life shaped not by wealth or status, but by generosity, compassion, and a love that had quietly risen from the simplest beginning.